I stopped in front of a high-end children's clothing store, intending to buy a small gift for my niece at home. But suddenly, my feet seemed glued to the sidewalk, and I gasped for a breath. On the other side of the transparent glass, under the dazzling light of a crystal chandelier, a man was kneeling on a polished wooden floor. With meticulous care, he was putting tiny leather shoes on the feet of a pretty little boy of about 3. Beside him, a young woman with wavy, curly hair smiled contentedly, holding an expensive Birkin bag. The scene was so beautiful, complete, and happy that it made one envious. But ironically, every feature on the man's face, from the slight frown as he tied the shoelaces to the small mole behind his left earlobe, was familiar to me, deeply etched in my memory. That was my husband, the man I thought had died in a horrific plane crash 5 years ago, the man whose funerals I had spent my entire fortune on. If you're watching this right now, take a moment to like and subscribe to my channel, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from, because I want to know how far this story travels. Now, let me tell you how I became the woman standing in that street, realizing my entire life had been carefully. 5 years ago, they told me my husband died on a rain-slick highway just outside Phoenix. His car crushed so badly that there was nothing left for me to identify. Nothing I could touch to convince my hands that he was truly gone. I remember sitting in a plastic chair at the police station, staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold, listening to a man in uniform explain timelines and impact angles, as if he were describing someone else's tragedy, not the moment my life quietly collapsed inward. There was no body to dress, no last look, only an urn handed to me days later, warm from someone else's hands, along with papers I barely read and signatures I don't remember writing, my name looping across official forms while my mind floated somewhere far above the room. The memorial came quickly, too quickly, as if speed could prevent doubt from taking root. His parents wanted a service at their church, the one he grew up in, the one we still attended out of habit and courtesy whenever we visited them, sitting in the back pew, heads lowered, silent during prayers that never belonged to us. He wasn't religious, not in belief and not in practice, but it was always an unspoken agreement. Don't challenge them, don't embarrass them, let it pass. When his mother said the church community would host everything, that the pastor would speak, that the women would bring food, I nodded because I was too tired to fight and too raw to explain that honoring my husband meant something very different to me than hymns and scripture. People lined up to hug me, their arms tight, their voices soft, whispering that they were praying for me, that God had a plan, that my husband was in a better place now. I thanked them because it felt cruel not to, because their kindness was real, even if their words scraped against me in ways I couldn't articulate. Each time someone said his soul was saved, I felt a small, private flinch, a quiet thought I swallowed whole, because correcting them would have shattered the fragile peace holding the room together. Standing there beside the urn, I watched his parents nod in comfort, their faith wrapping around them like a blanket. And I told myself that funerals weren't for the dead, they were for the living. And right then, the living were breaking apart in front of me. After the service, His brother squeezed my hand and thanked me for understanding, for doing this the right way. And I smiled because it was easier than explaining that I wasn't sure what the right way even looked like anymore. That night, alone in our bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed with my heels still on, staring at the dark ceiling, replaying every prayer spoken over a man who would have rolled his eyes at them, wondering if honoring his parents meant quietly erasing the parts of him only I truly knew. I told myself it didn't matter, that grief rearranges priorities, that love sometimes means bowing your head even when your heart doesn't follow. And in that silence, I made the first of many small concessions, believing they were harmless, believing they were temporary, not knowing I had just agreed to let my husband be rewritten, one gentle lie at a time. I told myself I was doing the right thing when I agreed to let the service follow their traditions, because funerals, everyone reminded me gently, are for the living. That sentence repeated itself in my head like a lullaby I didn't believe in but needed in order to sleep. I stood beside his parents in the front pew, hands folded, back straight, listening as the pastor spoke about a man I barely recognized. A man shaped by scripture and obedience. A devoted son guided by faith. A husband whose life had been anchored in beliefs he never once practiced behind closed doors. Each word drifted through the sanctuary, rising toward the stained glass windows. And with every sentence, I felt myself step a little farther back, like I was being asked to leave quietly without making a scene. The church filled with people who knew him only through his parents' stories, people who nodded solemnly, as if they had been present in our kitchen late at night, as if they had heard him laugh at the news or swear under his breath when the car wouldn't start, as if they knew the version of him who rolled his eyes during sermons and squeezed my hand afterward as we slipped out early. They didn't. But no one asked me to speak, and I didn't offer because grief had already taken enough from all of us, and I didn't want to be the one to fracture what little comfort his parents were holding on to. After the service, it didn't stop. The prayers followed us home, into the living room, into the kitchen, into every quiet moment where I thought I might finally breathe. His mother corrected me gently when I referred to something he loved that didn't fit her image of him. Her smile polite but firm, as if I had misspoken about a stranger. His father talked about signs and blessings, about how proud his son would be to know the church had honored him properly. And I nodded, again and again, because arguing felt like betrayal, even though staying silent felt like erasure. I watched photo albums being pulled from shelves, stories being retold and retouched, details smoothed until the edges of my husband blurred into something safer, something more acceptable to the room. People kept telling me they were praying for me, that God had a plan, that time would heal what I was feeling. I thanked them, hugged them, accepted their casseroles and soft words, while privately wondering when my role had shifted from wife to witness. Every time someone said he was at peace now, I swallowed the urge to say he never believed in the kind of peace they were offering him, that his comfort had always been found in small, ordinary things we built together, not in promises of heaven. But I didn't say it. I stood there, and let them talk over me, around me, about him, as if love were a volume game and the loudest voice won. In the days that followed, his parents took charge of everything without asking, deciding which friends should be notified, which stories should be shared, what details were appropriate to remember, and which ones were better left alone. I noticed how often they used the word our son, our loss, our faith, and how rarely anyone said, my husband or your husband. When I corrected someone gently, saying he preferred something different, his mother would tilt her head and smile, the way you do with a child who is confused, and say, I raised him, I know him. Each time she said it, something inside me tightened, a quiet panic creeping in as I realized that the man I had lived beside for years was slowly being claimed by people who loved him in a way that left no room for me. At night, alone, I replayed the services and conversations, asking myself whether I was honoring him by staying silent or simply making myself easier to overlook. I wondered when respecting the dead had started to feel like abandoning the living, and why protecting everyone else's comfort required me to disappear so completely. I was still there, still breathing, still married to his memory, yet I felt like a guest in a story that used to belong to me. It came to a head one afternoon as we sat together in their living room, sunlight filtering through the curtains, his mother holding a rosary loosely in her hand. She looked at the urn on the shelf, then at me, her voice calm, almost relieved, and said, at least, now, he's where he belongs. The flowers from the memorial were still standing in their vases when the first creditor came, not with raised voices or threats, but with paperwork neatly clipped, my husband's name printed clearly at the top, as if it were nothing more than another reminder card. I remember noticing how the petals had begun to curl inward, brown at the edges, while I stood at the doorway listening to a man explain balances, interest, and timelines, all in a voice so calm it felt rehearsed. I nodded, took the envelope, and thanked him, because gratitude had become automatic, something I offered even when I did not know what I was thanking people for anymore. After that, they didn't come all at once. They came in intervals, spaced just far enough apart to make me believe each one might be the last. Letters arrived first, then phone calls, then visits. Each time, the story was the same. Loans my husband had taken, guarantees he had signed, obligations he had left behind. The numbers grew heavier every time I heard them spoken out loud, but no one ever asked if I had known about any of it. It was simply assumed that I would handle it, that I would understand, that I would find a way. My in-laws sat at the dining table during most of these conversations. Quiet, hands folded, eyes fixed somewhere just past the people speaking. When the door closed and we were alone again, my mother-in-law would sigh and say it was all so sudden, so unfair, that none of them had been prepared for this. She would add gently that family helps family, that we would get through it together. The word together was used often, but it never came with specifics. It hovered in the air like a promise no one intended to define. I began selling things without announcing it. At first, it was small items, pieces that seemed easier to let go of, jewelry I rarely wore, objects tucked away in drawers. Then it became larger, heavier decisions. I sold the apartment my parents had helped us buy early in our marriage, telling myself that walls could be rebuilt, that space was not the same as home. I sold pieces from my father's collection, items he had spent years searching for, studying, restoring with his own hands. Each time I handed something over, I reminded myself that this was temporary, that once the debts were settled, I would rebuild, recover, replace. I learned not to linger on the memories attached to each item, because hesitation made everything harder. The money moved quickly, flowing out as soon as it came in. Hospital bills, legal fees, interest payments that seemed to regenerate no matter how much I paid. When I updated my in-laws, they listened with serious expressions, nodding as if absorbing the burden alongside me. Occasionally, they would say they could help a little, just for now, until things stabilized. But the help never materialized beyond words. Somehow, the responsibility always returned to me, resting there so naturally, it felt as though it had always belonged. Caring for them became part of the same routine. I drove them to appointments, sat in waiting rooms, learned medication schedules, adjusted my work around their needs without question. When neighbors commented on how devoted I was, how lucky they were to have me, I smiled and thanked them. It was easier than explaining that devotion, once assumed, becomes obligation when no one thinks to ask if you are still capable of it. No one ever asked how I was sleeping, whether the nights felt longer, whether the silence in the house pressed down too heavily. They asked instead if the bills had been paid, if the next payment was due soon, if I had heard back from the bank. The creditors became familiar. I recognized their voices, their phrases, the pauses they used before reminding me that grief did not suspend responsibility. I learned how to speak their language, calm and precise, because emotion only made them impatient. I negotiated extensions, rearranged payments, shifted money from one place to another, building a fragile structure that held just long enough to move forward another week. After each call, I would sit quietly for a moment, letting the silence settle, before standing up again to continue whatever needed doing. At night, when the house finally slept, I reviewed accounts and statements, lining papers up on the table, checking figures again and again. I didn't cry over them. Crying felt inefficient. Instead, I focused on accuracy, on keeping everything balanced, on making sure nothing slipped through unnoticed. I told myself that once this phase passed, once the debts were resolved, I would finally have room to grieve properly, to feel what I had been postponing. My in-laws often spoke about the future in vague terms, about how things would improve, how life would eventually return to something like normal. They spoke as if survival were guaranteed, as if endurance were infinite. When they thanked me, it was usually in public, in front of others, telling stories about how strong I was, how my husband would have wanted this. I never corrected them. Correcting them would have required asking questions I wasn't ready to hear answered. As the weeks turned into months, I noticed how naturally everyone had settled into their roles. I was the one who paid, the one who organized, the one who absorbed. They were the ones who waited, who worried aloud, who relied. It wasn't cruelty in the beginning, just assumption. But assumption has weight, and over time, it presses down just as firmly as intent. Somewhere along the way, I stopped expecting anyone to notice how much of myself was being spent. I stopped waiting for someone to ask if I could keep going. I learned how to carry exhaustion quietly, how to move through days on habit alone. The debts had arrived after the flowers for a reason. Someone had to pay. And by the time I understood that fully, my name was already written neatly on every line. I saw him on an ordinary afternoon, the kind that carries no warning, no shift in the air to tell you something irreversible is about to happen. I had stepped into a small shopping arcade to escape the cold, my coat still buttoned, my bag heavy on my shoulder, my mind occupied with nothing more than a list of errands I wanted to finish before going home. I wasn't looking for anything. I wasn't thinking about the past. I was simply moving forward the way I had trained myself to do. The storefront window stopped me. At first, it wasn't his face. It was the way he stood, slightly angled, weight resting on his right foot, one hand tucked into his pocket while the other adjusted something out of view. That posture hit me before recognition did, like a muscle memory waking up without permission. I slowed, then stopped, pretending to look at a display I didn't care about. My reflection faintly overlapping the scene inside. There was a man kneeling on the polished floor, tying a child's shoe with careful fingers, looping the laces twice, tightening them just enough. I knew that gesture. I had watched it countless times, in our hallway, in hotel rooms, at the foot of our bed, when he thought I was still asleep. He always pulled the lace once, paused, then adjusted again, as if perfection mattered even in the smallest things. The child was a boy, no more than 3 or 4. He stood patiently, hands resting on the man's shoulders, trusting, familiar. When the man finished, he looked up and smiled. That same small smile I had memorized years ago. The one that never showed teeth. The one that appeared only when he felt safe. Beside them stood a woman. She was watching them with a softness that made her face glow, one hand resting lightly on the counter, the other holding a shopping bag that swung gently against her leg. Her hair fell forward when she leaned down to say something to the boy. And when she laughed, the man looked up at her instinctively, responding without thinking. It was an exchange too smooth to be recent, too practiced to be accidental. I knew her. It took a few seconds for the recognition to settle. But once it didn't leave. She had stood in my kitchen before, had sat across from me at dinner, had smiled politely while thanking me for my husband's mentorship, his patience, his guidance. She had always kept her voice low, her eyes respectful, her posture careful. Seeing her now, relaxed and certain, felt like watching a mask slip without warning. I didn't move closer. I didn't step back. I stayed exactly where I was, my reflection hovering between the glass and their lives, invisible and misplaced. I noticed details I hadn't intended to see. The watch on his wrist, the coat draped over the chair beside him, the ease with which the child leaned into his space, unafraid, accustomed. I noticed the way the woman adjusted the boy's collar without asking, the way the man handed her his wallet without looking. It wasn't shock that filled me then. It was alignment. Pieces sliding into place quietly, without drama. This wasn't confusion or coincidence. This was structure, routine, a life assembled with care. My breath stayed steady, my hands didn't shake. I felt strangely distant from my own body, as if I were observing the scene the way I observed objects at work, cataloging features, noting condition, tracing provenance. I had spent years learning how to separate appearance from truth, how to recognize authenticity beneath layers of polish. That training took over now, cool and precise. The boy looked up suddenly, and for a moment I saw his face fully. The eyes, the shape of the nose, the slight crease near the mouth when he frowned. I didn't need to lean closer. I didn't need confirmation. Some things announced themselves without words. The man laughed at something the woman said, and the sound reached me through the glass, muted but unmistakable. It was his laugh, the same one that used to fill our house late at night, the one I hadn't heard in years but had never truly forgotten. I took a step to the side, letting another passerby block my reflection, adjusting my position just enough to remain unseen. I didn't raise my phone. I didn't take a picture. I didn't need proof yet. Proof was for later. This moment was for understanding. They gathered their things calmly, the woman guiding the boy toward the door, the man paying without checking the receipt. When they stood, the boy reached for his hand automatically, and he took it without hesitation. They looked like a family because they were one. No performance, no tension, no careful acting. As they walked past the window, close enough that I could see the faint line at the man's temple, the familiar mark behind his ear, he glanced up briefly, scanning the crowd. I turned my head slightly, studying the display beside me with sudden interest. My face angled away, my posture relaxed. If he sensed something, he didn't show it. They passed without slowing, disappearing into the flow of people, as if they had always belonged there. I stayed where I was long after they were gone. I didn't cry. I didn't feel the urge to chase them, to call out a name that suddenly felt outdated. The street continued around me, footsteps echoing, voices overlapping, life moving forward with no regard for the moment that had just split mine in two. When I finally turned away from the glass, I did so carefully, as if sudden movement might break something fragile inside me. I walked to my car, unlocked it, sat behind the wheel, and rested my hands there without starting the engine. My reflection in the windshield looked calm, composed, unchanged. That steadiness surprised me more than anything else. I understood then that seeing him wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of clarity. Not rage, not grief, recognition. I wasn't ready to confront him. Not yet. After that afternoon, nothing felt urgent, and yet everything began to move. I didn't rush home to search drawers or pull statements in a frenzy. I went back to my routine, to the habits I had perfected over years of endurance, and let the image I had seen settle where it belonged. It didn't demand action. It asked for accuracy. I started with what I already knew: the debts. The amounts were familiar, memorized by repetition rather than understanding. I laid the statements out on the dining table one evening, aligning the edges, smoothing the corners, reading them again, not as obligations, but as artifacts. Dates. destinations, intermediaries, patterns I had never bothered to examine because I had trusted the premise behind them. Now I read without that premise. The payments I had made were consistent, disciplined, almost elegant in their regularity. Mortgage interest, loan servicing, legal fees, emergency transfers that had arrived with urgency and left without explanation. I traced each one backward, following the routes they had taken, noticing how often the trail thinned just before clarity. Accounts closed, entities dissolved, addresses that existed on paper but not in practice. I didn't feel anger as I recognized this. I felt something closer to cold appreciation. The structure had been designed carefully. I compared those numbers to what I had seen through the glass. The coat, the watch, the way he had paid without checking the receipt. None of it matched the narrative I had been living inside. I hadn't been keeping a household afloat. I had been feeding another one. The realization didn't land with impact. It spread, slow and even, like ink in water. I began noticing small absences, items that should have been accounted for but weren't. A property that had been discussed years earlier and then quietly removed from conversation. An investment folder that had disappeared from the cabinet where it used to sit. I asked about none of it. Asking would have required answers, and answers would have ended the flow of information. Silence, I had learned, invited carelessness. My in-laws spoke freely around me, their confidence reinforced by years of compliance. They complained about expenses while mentioning, in passing, repairs that had already been made. They worried aloud about money while describing purchases that assumed its presence. Sometimes they contradicted themselves within the same conversation, forgetting what they had already said to me that day. I listened, nodded, stored each inconsistency without reaction. When my mother-in-law reminded me of upcoming costs, her tone was always gentle, almost apologetic, as if the burden were temporary, shared, regrettable. She would say things like, "Just until things improve," or "once everything settles." Phrases without dates, without limits. My father-in-law spoke less, but when he did, it was with an assurance that surprised me, as if the resources he referenced were guaranteed. I noted that too. I continued to pay, on time, without complaint. I transferred money the way I always had, calmly, methodically, documenting everything as a matter of habit rather than intention. Each confirmation email, each receipt, each bank notification was saved, labeled, filed, not as evidence yet, as record. There is a difference. At night, I compared timelines. The months when the debts had been most aggressive coincided neatly with the period when I later learned he had settled abroad. The spikes in payment requests aligned with the purchases I had seen reflected in glass. It wasn't proof. It was coherence. The kind that doesn't need explanation once you see it. The role of my in-laws became clearer the longer I observed without interrupting. They weren't confused. They weren't misled. They knew enough to participate and not enough to question. They had benefited from my reliability and from his absence in equal measure. Whether they had known the full shape of the deception no longer mattered. They had chosen the side that fed them. I thought about the woman I had seen with him, about the ease with which she moved through that life, And I understood that what I had been funding was not a secret affair or a temporary escape. It was infrastructure, housing, stability, continuity, a child raised without interruption, a future constructed from pieces of mine. That understanding didn't hollow me out the way I might have expected. It steadied me. Emotion clouds assessment. Distance clarifies it. I had been given distance unwillingly, and I used it. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't change my behavior in ways that could be noticed. I continued to show up, to manage appointments, to handle payments, to keep the household running. From the outside, nothing shifted. Inside, everything had aligned. I stopped asking myself, why? Why invites explanation, and explanation offers excuses. Instead, I focused on how the money moved, how decisions were made, how responsibility was assigned without discussion, how silence had been rewarded with access. One afternoon, my mother-in-law mentioned an account I had never seen, referencing it casually as if I were already familiar. When I asked her to clarify, she waved it off, saying it wasn't important, that it had been handled. I apologized for asking and changed the subject. Later, I wrote the account name down exactly as she had said it. Careful with spelling. Small slips matter. I noticed, too, how often my husband's name was still used as leverage. He would have wanted this. This was his plan. You know how he was with these things. His absence had become a tool, shaped to fit any request. I let it remain that way. Tools wear down with use. By the end of the week, I no longer felt uncertainty. I felt orientation. Everything I had paid for had a different address. Everything I had maintained had been sustaining something that excluded me by design. That knowledge didn't require confrontation. It required timing. I understood then that the life I had been protecting was not mine, and that the people I had been protecting were not confused about that distinction. They had simply assumed I would continue. I allowed them to keep assuming. I went home and did exactly what I had always done, only more carefully, more deliberately, as if every ordinary motion carried a second purpose I kept to myself. I arrived early, greeted them softly, took my coat off the same way, placed my bag in the same spot by the door. Nothing about me announced a shift. That was important. Change invites attention. Consistency invites neglect. The days settled into repetition. Transfers scheduled before breakfast. Messages answered with brief confirmations. Bills paid on time, sometimes early. I lowered my voice when I spoke, kept my eyes down when decisions were mentioned, nodded in the places where agreement was expected. I apologized when I didn't need to, and thanked them when nothing had been offered. It wasn't humiliation, it was positioning. I continued to care for them as before. Appointments arranged, prescriptions refilled, meals prepared according to preference. When my mother-in-law complained about cost, I adjusted menus quietly. When my father-in-law needed help standing, I steadied him without comment. People assume endurance means consent. I let them assume. At the same time, I began to keep records the way I used to catalog objects at work, without judgment, without narrative. Dates first, then amounts, then words. I wrote down phrases exactly as they were said. not paraphrased, not softened. Just for now, until things improve. Your husband would have wanted this. I didn't assign meaning. I preserved them. I saved statements in duplicate, screenshots of transfers, emails confirming payments, notes scribbled on envelopes that arrived without warning. When something was handed to me verbally, I followed up with a polite message asking for confirmation, framed as concern for accuracy. People rarely refuse when the request sounds helpful. Their confidence grew with my silence. They spoke more freely around me, forgetting to lower their voices when they thought I was in another room. They discussed expenses as if the money were already guaranteed. They referenced accounts I hadn't been shown, repairs I hadn't approved, arrangements made without asking. I didn't interrupt. I listened from where I stood, invisible by habit. There were small mistakes. A date mentioned twice, two different ways. A payment assumed to have come from me that I hadn't sent yet. A reference to the other account, followed by a quick dismissal. I caught each one and wrote it down later, careful not to let recognition change my expression in the moment. I made myself smaller in conversation. I spoke last, if at all. When asked for my opinion, I deferred. When praised for being capable, I smiled and redirected credit. It made people comfortable. Comfort makes people careless. At night, after the house quieted, I spread everything out on the table. I compared notes. I matched phrases to transactions. I aligned timelines without forcing conclusions. The picture didn't arrive all at once. It assembled itself patiently, the way things do when you stop interfering. Money continued to leave my accounts. I let it. Each transfer documented, labeled, stored. I didn't rush to protect what remained. Protection signals fear. I wanted them unguarded. Occasionally, my mother-in-law would comment on how tired I looked, usually in front of others. "You work too hard for this family," she would say, her hand resting briefly on my arm. I thanked her and poured more tea. Concern that stops at observation doesn't require response. When relatives called, they spoke to them first. I was handed the phone at the end, asked how I was doing, praised for my strength, reminded to stay strong. I answered with the same few phrases every time. "I'm managing, one day at a time." They didn't ask more. They never do. I noticed how often my husband's absence was used as explanation. Plans justified, requests softened, boundaries erased. His name had become a permission slip. I let it continue to function that way. The more it was used, the more trace it left. There were days when the repetition pressed down harder, when the weight of compliance felt physical. But I treated those moments the way I treated fatigue at work. I acknowledged them and kept going. Emotion wasn't useful yet. Precision was. By the end of the month, I had a system. Everything that entered my hands was logged. Everything that left was tracked. Conversations were recorded in memory and transferred to paper as soon as I was alone. I didn't store anything where it could be found. I didn't share anything with anyone. This wasn't secrecy. It was containment. They continued to believe I was simply enduring. They mistook my steadiness for surrender. They mistook my silence for agreement. It wasn't either. It was patience. I went home every day and played my role better than ever. The invitation didn't sound like a trap. It never does. It arrived the way everything else had in this house, framed as necessity, softened with concern, wrapped in language that suggested care, while assuming compliance. My mother-in-law mentioned it over breakfast, stirring her coffee slowly, as if the thought had just occurred to her. She said there was an opportunity, something my husband would have wanted us to consider, a way to finally bring things back together and put an end to the uncertainty. She spoke about closure, about family, about doing what was right for everyone. I listened without interrupting. I asked one question, neutral, almost deferential. What would that require? She answered easily, relieved, listing conditions that sounded reasonable on their own. A meeting, a discussion, a chance to resolve outstanding matters. No pressure, no confrontation, just a conversation, she said, because everyone was tired of living like this. They were right about one thing. Everyone was tired. And tired people reach for relief without checking its shape. The conditions were precise: a return, a signature, access to documents I already controlled, a chance, they said, to finalize arrangements and move forward. The words were careful. The assumptions underneath them were not. They believed mercy would look like silence. They believed reconciliation would look like compliance. They believed I would be grateful for the chance to restore what they thought still existed. I agreed. I agreed without negotiation, without hesitation, without asking for assurances. Agreement disarms suspicion. It reassures people who mistake consent for control. I said I would arrange everything. I said I understood. I said thank you. From that moment, they moved quickly. Plans were made without checking with me again. Dates were set. Messages were sent. They spoke openly now, confident that the hardest part had been resolved. My husband's return was discussed as if it were inevitable, as if it were already decided. They spoke about logistics, about what would be needed, about how to present everything properly so there would be no misunderstandings. I kept paying. I kept answering messages. I kept my tone unchanged. In parallel, I closed doors quietly. The records I had collected were copied, organized, indexed, not summarized, not interpreted, preserved exactly as they were. Transfers matched to dates, statements aligned with conversations, messages saved in sequence. I didn't add commentary. Commentary invites argument. Facts do not. I forwarded nothing from my personal accounts. I shared nothing verbally. Everything moved through channels designed for clarity rather than comfort. When confirmations were needed, I asked for them politely, framing each request as efficiency. People complied. They always do when they think the process is still theirs. The day before the meeting, my mother-in-law came to my room unannounced, carrying tea. She placed the cup on the table and said she was proud of me, that this had been hard on all of us, that forgiveness was a strength. She reminded me that families survive by choosing each other, not by keeping score. I thanked her and waited until she left before I poured the tea out. The morning itself was unremarkable. I dressed simply. I arrived on time. I brought only what I was asked to bring. They were already there when I entered, seated close together, their posture relaxed in a way that suggested victory. My husband arrived last. He looked as he always had when he wanted something: calm, composed, attentive in a way that felt performative once you knew where to look. He smiled when he saw me, a small adjustment at the corner of his mouth, as if practicing familiarity. He thanked me for coming. He said this was overdue. I took my seat and waited. They began with explanations, with justifications, with stories that framed decisions as misunderstandings, consequences as accidents. They spoke about pressure, about mistakes, about circumstances that had forced their hand. My husband spoke last, his voice steady, his gaze careful. He said he had never intended for things to go this far. He said he had trusted others to manage details. He said he wanted to make things right. I didn't respond. I let the silence do the work. When it was my turn, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I didn't ask questions. I placed a folder on the table and slid it forward. It wasn't thick. It didn't need to be. It contained only what mattered. I told them I had brought exactly what they had asked for. I told them everything was there. I told them they could read it in any order they preferred. The room changed slowly, not dramatically. A pause, a shift in posture. My husband opened the folder and stopped smiling. My mother-in-law leaned forward, squinting at the first page, then the second. My father-in-law said nothing, his eyes moving back and forth as if tracking something that refused to settle. No one interrupted me when I spoke again. I read the names calmly: account numbers, dates, locations. I matched each to a document in the folder. I didn't explain what they meant. I didn't need to. They recognized themselves. My husband tried once to interject, to redirect the conversation toward intent, toward emotion. I didn't respond to that either. I continued where I had left off. I listed transactions that had been described as debts. I matched them to addresses that no longer belonged to me. I noted timelines that overlapped too neatly to be coincidence. My mother-in-law asked me to stop. She said this wasn't the time. I told her this was the only time. I didn't accuse them of betrayal. I didn't call them liars. I didn't describe how it had felt. I named actions. I named outcomes. I named responsibility. When I finished, I closed the folder and placed my hands on it, keeping it where everyone could see. There was no shouting, no collapse, no dramatic confession. There was only the sound of someone realizing that mercy had a cost and that it was no longer being extended. I stood up. I said the meeting was over. I said everything else would proceed without further discussion. I thanked them for their time. My husband followed me into the hallway. He asked if we could talk privately. He said there had been misunderstandings. He said he could explain. I told him explanations were no longer relevant. I told him to direct any further communication through the appropriate channels. I told him not to contact me again. He said my name once, softly, the way he used to when he wanted reassurance. I didn't turn around. Behind me, doors closed. Not loudly, not ceremonially, simply closed. I left without looking back, carrying nothing I hadn't arrived with. The trap hadn't required force. It had required patience. It had required letting them believe mercy would protect them. It didn't. By the time I reached the end of the corridor, everything that needed to be done had already been set in motion. The law did what it always does when given time and clean lines. It moved forward without urgency, without spectacle, without regard for how long I had carried things alone. Files were opened, accounts were examined, statements were read by people who had never known us and didn't need to. Dates aligned, numbers matched, names appeared where they were supposed to. When questions came, I answered them once, clearly, and then stopped speaking. I didn't attend hearings unless I was required to. I didn't sit in hallways waiting for news. I didn't follow the updates closely. What mattered had already left my hands. I had learned that distance is not avoidance. Sometimes it is the most accurate position. My husband tried to reach me through intermediaries at first. Short messages, requests framed as concern, then longer ones, threaded with explanations I had already heard in the room where everything ended. I didn't respond. Silence isn't punishment. It's a boundary. My in-laws stopped calling after the first official notice arrived. There was a pause, a few days where nothing happened, and then the tone of the messages shifted. Not anger, not apology, confusion. They asked what would happen next, what they should expect, whether I could help them understand. I didn't reply to those either. Understanding is not something you outsource after the fact. I packed my things over the course of a week, slowly, selectively. I didn't take much. Documents, clothes, a few objects that had survived everything else. I left the rest where it was. Houses remember too much. I wasn't interested in carrying more memory than necessary. On my last night there, I walked through each room once. Not to say goodbye, to confirm. The quiet didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt complete. I left early the next morning, locking the door behind me and placing the key on the table where it could be found. I didn't leave a note. Notes invite interpretation. There was nothing left to interpret. People asked later if I felt relieved. I told them I felt finished. Relief implies release from something that still has weight. This didn't. It had reached its end. The process concluded the way these things do. Notices delivered. Access revoked. Decisions finalized in rooms I never entered. When it was done, it was done. I didn't ask for explanations. I didn't seek acknowledgement. I didn't need to see anyone humbled to feel whole. I moved to a place where no one knew my name or my history. I chose it because it was quiet, because it asked nothing of me. I established routines that belonged only to me. Morning walks, simple meals, work that didn't require negotiation. I stopped living on alert. Sometimes, fragments of the old life surfaced without warning. A phrase someone used, a sound in a public space, a particular way of standing that caught my attention before I could stop it. When that happened, I noticed it and let it pass. Recognition doesn't require engagement. I didn't rebuild what had been lost. I built something else, something narrower, something honest. I never confronted my husband again. I never asked him why. Why is a question that assumes the answer will matter. It wouldn't have. I didn't forgive him either. Forgiveness suggests a return. I wasn't returning anywhere. What surprised me most was how little satisfaction I felt when it was over. There was no moment of triumph, no sense of victory, just a quiet understanding that I was no longer involved. That was enough. I didn't win. Winning would have meant staying long enough to see someone else lose. I didn't lose either. Losing would have meant I had still been playing. I left the game, and I didn't look back to see who was still sitting at the table.